Welcome, Week 17 here with Jim McCormick, talking running backs and the running back landscape on a week where only some of the teams are motivated to win. But before we get to the backs, let me tell you about, there we go, rotocurve.com/big-game, rotocurve.com/big-game. You can win free tickets plus fan experience events to Big Game 51. This, of course, sponsored by rotocurve.com. It's a 4-night trip from February 2nd to the 6th with 2 tickets to the big game, upgraded lower-level end zone seats, VIP tickets to that Antonio Brown celebrity game. We will not be seeing any Antonio Brown during Week 17, but you can see him during the big game. An $800 airfare credit, all-you-can-eat tailgate, and, of course, the pregame party with Joe Montana and Warren Moon. Go ahead and check it out. And, Jim, it's a weird week. We already found out that we're probably not going to see Le'Veon Bell. We saw last week that Ezekiel Elliott barely outsnapped Darren McFadden, and now they have even less to play for. Who do you like at the running back position? It seems like there's only one guy to spend up for.
Yeah, it's David Johnson, right? The yardage monster. I mean, it's the only direct reference for his season so far is LaDainian Tomlinson's 2006, which is ridiculous. You know, it's the first season since then with 2,000 total yards and 20 touchdowns. He's second in PPR points per game, only to Tomlinson's 2006. It's like 25.8 points per game, and that's just using ESPN. That's without the bonuses that you see on a lot of these, on a lot of DFS markets. So, yeah, Johnson's just amazing. Last week, even as it seemed he scored right away, but it seemed like the yardage day was going to be slow, and then he just exploded. So yeah, he and the Rams, I think they have a reputation for whatever reason of being an okay defense. They're really not that good, actually. They've yielded the 5th most points per drive over the last month, and they've the second highest touchdown per drive rate. So. I actually don't mind Arizona. We didn't mention Carson Palmer because I don't really like. I think there's too many other options to really take that risk. But I still think the Arizona offense could move the ball here. And it's also about Jared Goff. Actually, bad quarterback play on the other side. He has at least 2 turnovers in every game over the last month or at the last 3 weeks. It's the longest streak in the league this season. He's just terrible, basically. And I think it just leads to extra added possessions, maybe extra goal line touches for Johnson. So. It's fairly obvious. You don't need to overhype David Johnson. I also like Bilal Powell. I know he's not practicing today, but I'm not too worried about that. He's been their bell cow. I don't see reason to play Forte with this knee injury. If they did, you would just fade both. But he's an entirely reasonable. It's entirely reasonable to project him with like the 2nd or 3rd highest ceiling of the slate. I think at running back. The Dolphins are also terrible against the run. It's just a lot of targets. So and otherwise, we're also going into another kind of either-or situation with Pittsburgh. D'Angelo Williams hasn't really been healthy for most of the season, so I think it's difficult to say he's going to right away go in and get 25 touches, but they've done this before, right? They've taken guys off injury and plugged them right in, so if he is the guy, he's minimum priced on FanDuel. I think you have to get him in there. He's 4,500 on FanDuel, and then if not, Fitzgerald Toussaint, I mean, you're not nearly as excited, I don't think. There's no production pedigree, but stacking or getting shares against this Cleveland team, if you wanted to get contrarian and do like Landry Jones and the running back, I think that still works because they're going to score points against this Browns team. And then I really like Jaquiz Rodgers. I know he doesn't have the receiving upside that most of these guys have, but Sims just went to IR. Doug Martin's facing a suspension and some personal issues. So, Quiz has gotten the workload before. I think his 30-plus carry game actually came against Carolina earlier this year. And they've allowed, above average. Without Kuechly, they're allowing 4.7 yards per carry, 2.6 yards before contact. So it's a really good situation. Those are my 4 cash guys, actually. I have more intriguing, kind of upside laden, tournament guys. But these are my options for cash. Who do you identify in cash?
Oh, okay. So I like a bunch of those guys. I mean, I think David Johnson is a guy that I'm probably going to lock in. My number 2 is probably Mark Ingram against the Atlanta Falcons. I mean, this is a guy who over the last 2 weeks, 17 and 18 carries. I think the Tim Hightower experiment, at least for it to be option 1A and 1B, is more than over. So in a game with this many points, I do think we see a ton of Mark Ingram, and hopefully he finds the end zone. I mean, he's pretty reasonable, 5,600 on DraftKings, and I'll get you a FanDuel price in a second. I know that was reasonable comfortable too. Let's see, 6,100. But I think he's got, RB1 upside this week. Not maybe the RB1, but like a true RB1 upside.
Right.
So I definitely like him. Thomas Rawls against San Francisco. It looks like he's going to play through this injury, so I don't think we need to be worried about him. So he's kind of a LeGarrette Blount talent where we don't expect him to catch a lot of passes. But against San Francisco, obviously for cash games, if Todd Gurley can get 17 fantasy points against them, then the sky is the ceiling for anyone else. He's been absolutely horrible, and he got it done. So I don't think we're really worried against San Francisco. So we got Johnson, we got Ingram, we got Rawls. I definitely like the Powell call. I'm a little worried that they called up a back from the practice team. That worries me a little. But if Powell plays, I think he's good to go. And I'm going back to the well that didn't work last week in Frank Gore. Pretty much the doomsday scenario emerged where they're playing from behind, and they use Robert Turbin when they're playing from behind. But at home against Jacksonville, I don't really think you have that concern this week. I still think, they're going to either be in it or right there with them. So I think it's a 20 carry week for Frank Gore. So I think at 4,700 on DraftKings, if he got burned last week, it's a decent week to go back to him. And the only other cash game guy, I actually have a lot of cash game guys this week, is LeGarrette Blount. Again, New England, something to play for. Miami bad against the run. So I think LeGarrette Blount's, this is a week where they pound him. I think he finds himself another goal line touch. I mean, 17 touchdowns leads even David Johnson at the position. So there's a whole lot of touchdowns there. And those are the guys I like in cash. Who do you like for tournaments?
In tournaments, I actually don't mind. I do like Blount a lot, actually. I appreciate him in cash and enough in tournaments. But if I'm going to be a little bit more contrarian, Dion Lewis has 37 touches the last 2 weeks. They do have something to play for, but I don't think getting him increased exposure is at the expense of their own success. So it's not like an experience only kind of factor. But I do actually think they're preparing for the playoffs to have Lewis be a real weapon, and I think they want to get him as much work as possible. That's been the case. He's essentially splitting carries. He doesn't have that goal line upside, obviously, but he looks good on tape. There's playmaking ability in both phases, receiving and on the ground. And like I said, 34 touches on the ground. The receiving has kind of been limited recently, but yeah, it's not a bad setup, and I think the price is reasonable enough, and I think ownership will be low. I mean, and then I'm going back to, we already mentioned some of the fade reasons that you consider for Matt Ryan, and I can't completely disagree with them. I just think there's so many points to be had in that game that you can consider Ryan. But Devonta Freeman he could even, it's completely fine to consider him in cash as well. It really is, just because, he's third in the league behind only Blount and David Johnson in red zone touches among backs. Really behind anybody in the NFL. He did the same thing in goal to goal. So it's not just like a red zone stat. It's also really in close. He's also elite. So, I mean, last time he played them, he had 207 yards. The Saints, he had 207 yards and a touchdown. I know what did Coleman have 3 touchdowns in that game? So Coleman really feasted on big plays, but this is the guy who's their lead kind of closer. And in a game with that point total, I think having shares of a guy with this much upside is completely fine. And then, yeah, like you said, I'm into Rawls more and if not him, they called up a practice squad guy as well, and they just auditioned 5 running backs for Seattle. So if he does sit, Alex Collins is interesting. But I think whoever starts for Seattle, I think for me, profiles more as a tournament guy, because I'm not sure one guy takes the complete lead there. But either way, I do think there's a lot of upside there. I mean, because like you said, anybody can eat against San Francisco.
Yeah, I think for me, if Rawls were to sit, Alex Collins looked like he was shot out of a cannon last week.
Yeah,
I mean, that's
and the receiving's there too.
That would be the guy that I would feel definitely comfortable with in all formats. And
that makes sense.
I mean, kind of out of that same boat, Ryan Matthews placed on IR. So I really like Darren Sproles this week in tournaments. Yeah, I think it's him and what's the other guy's name? Byron Mitchell. Is the only 2 healthy backs for them. And Dallas is a team that's very stout against the run, but 20th in DVOA against backs out of the backfield. I mean, earlier this year, Sproles went for over 80 yards rushing. I think that was a career high, if I'm not mistaken. But it was definitely a season high for Darren Sproles. And he also caught a few passes against them. Let me get you the exact numbers. It was 5 passes. He was targeted 7 times, only for 17 yards, but still, I mean, now it's pretty much his show. So for tournaments, I know Philly, not exactly something something to play for. But I think there'll be enough work there and enough, fantasy relevant work that it's going to make some sense. You mentioned Dion Lewis. That was a guy who I definitely have on my list, so I can't argue with you there. I think Sean Drawn, if what's his name? If Carlos Hyde is out, which I think he is, right?
He's on IR, yeah.
Yeah, exactly. So Drawn's the guy. I mean, that one's kind of it could develop into a little bit of a committee as well. But Drawn's the guy who at least catches the passes.
He dominated touches last week with over Harris. So Kelly's tough to trust. I agree, but there is upside.
Exactly. With their fast-paced offense, I know it's Seattle, but Seattle's defense is not what it once was, especially against the run. So I definitely like that. And the only other guy that I got for you for tournaments is Jordan Howard, who had a monster game against Minnesota. I don't really think this Minnesota defense is what we thought it was at the beginning of the year. I mean, they've kind of been torched by everyone recently. And you look at the game, 26 carries, 153 yards, and a touchdown. For Jordan Howard against them last time, even caught 4 for 49. So that was almost 6 yards a carry against this defense. I think, Howard is a guy that they're still going to rely on. It's still Matt Barkley, who threw 5 interceptions last week.
Yep.
So if Fox is trying to end the season on a good note, I think they end up riding Howard. And I will give you an honorable mention is Ty Montgomery, a guy who has looked awfully good this week. That if the Packers do decide to kind of give him a workload, I think there's upside for him as well. Do we miss anything at the running back position?
No, I think there's a lot of options there. You got your premier kind of studs, and then it's a bunch of value other than that. I think Freeman and Johnson are like the 2 premier studs. Maybe Blunt's in that category with all these touchdowns. But then otherwise, it's like there's just a lot of good value out there, and I think it's going to allow you to. That's why I'm comfortable paying up a quarterback. But we'll get into that in roster construction.
There you go. So before we go, though, do want to remind you, rotocurve.com/big-game. You can win free tickets plus the fan experience events to Houston, Texas in February. So go ahead and check that out. rotocurve.com/big-game. Jim and I will be back with wide receivers before we get to the roster construction that he alluded to.